Welcome to Survivor Voices Show with me, your hostess, Vennie Kocsis. I am the author of Cult Child and other publications, which you can explore on my website, VennieKocsis.com. That is VennieKocsis.com. Survivor Voices Show is dedicated to providing a platform for trauma survivors to tell our stories in a safe space. Each show will bring you a plethora of topics from authors to artists, survivors living with impairments, healing journeys, updated news, and real, raw, vulnerable moments of laughter and sometimes tears. Find me on Twitter using hashtag Survivor Voices. Connect with me on Facebook at Survivor Voices Show page. Join our Facebook group, Survivor Voices, where you will find support and be embraced as you share your life. Thank you for being here. And now, here is our show. Who I have with me is an amazing lady. Her name is Janet Heimlich. She is the founder and author of, or she's the founder of the Child Friendly Faith Project and the author of a really amazing book, Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. This is the first book to fully examine the issue of religious child maltreatment. Janet is a former freelance reporter for National Public Radio and has won 9 journalism awards. She has also written nonfiction articles for publications such as Texas Monthly, the Austin American Statesman, and the Texas Observer. Janet graduated from Stanford University with a bachelor or a BA in communications. So, Jaime, to introduce you, joining Janet Heimlich is Dr. Jaime Romo. He is the president of the Child Friendly Faith Project. Dr. Romo is a commissioned minister in the United Church for Christ for Healing and Healthy Environments in San Diego, and a consultant with the Center for Applied Research Solutions and the National Mentoring Resource Center. Dr. Romo earned his doctorate in educational leadership from the University of San Diego and is a certified traumatic incident reduction facilitator. I really love that phrase, by the way. So thank you both so much for hanging in there with me. I'm so glad I got us all together. Jan, I was going to just start with you. You know, I had the chance to sit down and have lunch with both of you recently in Santa Fe and talk about this topic, and it's really dear to my heart because of my own background. And if you didn't mind just starting out, you know, what led you to do this work, to write this incredible book and start your organization?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I started this whole process as a freelance journalist, and I was always on the lookout for important stories that I would then pitch to editors. And if people hadn't covered it already, you know, they'd usually give me the green light. When I started learning more about child abuse cases, on most cases that, you know, made high profile news stories, oftentimes it was a death. And I just was really kind of devastated learning about a lot of these reports. And so I started to look into them more and more, where it was quite clear that the perpetrators were inspired, if you will, by their religious beliefs. These weren't people who were mentally ill for the most part, or had severe anger management issues necessarily, or even were poor, which is poverty is a big risk factor in a lot of abuse cases. These were people that were just feeling very righteous about what they believed about God, about what they learned in their place of worship, or how they were raised. And the more I looked into it, the more I started asking my own friends about their backgrounds, I learned that a lot of people, unlike myself, were raised with a lot of religion, and in most cases, it was an unpleasant memory. I began looking into it more by just researching it. I was starting to interview people at that point, mostly survivors. I started reading academic studies and reviewing criminal cases. And these, again, were all cases of abuse or neglect where the perpetrators, even if they were on trial, would swear they were doing the righteous thing. And I just wasn't sure kind of what to do with all of this information, because clearly it wasn't something that was widely reported. So I felt that at that point it just needed to be a book. And so I found a publisher willing to publish a book that ended up being called Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. And that's kind of where it started for me.
And so now you have met Jaime. And Jaime, I know a little bit about your story. I think it's amazing that the two of you have come together to do this work on really educating. And I know, that we had a conversation about, not attacking people's religion, but really more focusing in on the effects this has on children. And Jaime, I don't know if what you're comfortable sharing about your own personal story and what led you to want to be a part of this organization also.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the work you're doing and it's creating a space for people to learn. I mean, at heart, I'm an educator, and I also have a deep commitment to healing. And so I grew up in Northeast LA in a second-generation Mexican-American family, so I identify as Chicano, actually. But, grew up with some things that were kind of traditional, culturally very deep reverence and obedience, respect. In Spanish, respeto means more than, I think, general respect. It's really a kind of deep honoring and, an inability to confront, to challenge or question elders. And we're also very, I call it cradle Catholic. We grew up in the Catholic Church, mom very, very involved. It was kind of an honor, right, to be an altar boy, to be someone who was of service and someone who was connected to the religious ceremonies. And so those were real important background pieces. I grew up in a very violent alcoholic home. Hungary, Janet mentioned poverty is risk factor for being vulnerable. Yeah, we were in a violent home. I wanted out. School and church were a safe place. And I had a real passion for justice work. So that's kind of where I had the idea going forward, growing up as maybe a lawyer, maybe a doctor, coming back to the neighborhood, helping kids who often were hurt in gangs or, hurt by a lot of street, violence and drugs and so on. And so I really wanted out of my neighborhood. I went to prep high school across town. I went to Stanford. Some people have described my trajectory as meteoric. It's like I really had passion to get out of what was painful growing up. And it was after I graduated, actually the year before I graduated from Stanford, I had a very powerful series of experiences that I felt like God was talking to me, and somehow I needed to go to the seminary, even though I hated that idea. And ended up in between the summer of graduation and the time I actually went, having this deep, call it conversion experience. So I was a zealot and disembodied from my past pain experiences. And little by little, those started coming back. And so I started dealing with, as a teacher, I left the seminary, got into teaching and being an administrator, dealt with family violence, dealt with old poverty issues and alcohol, all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't until I was a professor at the University of San Diego teaching teachers, and we were all about social justice. When I went to a conference in the East Coast during the summer of 2002, and that's when you're familiar with the movie Spotlight. All those revelations were coming to the public, and I was in this conference where people were not talking about social justice issues, and they certainly weren't talking about clergy sexual abuse. And all of a sudden, I started having memories of being groomed and sexually abused by the pastor, who was a high-ranking church official in the LA Archdiocese. And it began as trickles and became really like the Gulf oil spill. It just flooded. You know, when I came home, I saw my son laying on his bed with his shirt off. He was about 12, 13 at the time. And that opened up this huge flashback for me of me at that age. So the next several years, I was immersed in the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. I figured, you know, I've got a doctorate, I'm a researcher. I was facilitating support groups. I was dealing with all kinds of press. I was confronting the diocese. I was very public. And all that became too much. And so in my path of healing for myself, I took up ministry, left university. I was actually one of the plaintiffs in the LA Archdiocese class action suit. And so I had enough of that kind of adversarial, confrontational, painful work, being rejected by, you know, people I identified with as Catholic. And so as I took up ministry, it was with the UCC. It was focused very much on sexual abuse, religious authority sexual abuse. And that was too narrow, but it was very related to what we're doing with child-friendly faith. But little by little, I got more and more connected to the work around trauma overall. My doctorate is in educational leadership, so I understand something about organizations and the hidden dynamics in organizations and culture. And so when a friend, Victor Veith, who's quite an advocate from Minnesota, connected me with Jan, I was just really happy to connect with the kindred spirit, people who see all kinds of ways that faith groups assent to very abusive practices, and began then to be a resource, combining education, combining my desire to do justice and promote healing.
I wanted to ask you just, you know, your perspective on this. Why is, or from your perspective, sexual abuse so rampant within the church, and not just the Catholic Church, but in faith itself? Do you have a hypothesis or an understanding of why there's such a deep link there?
You know, it's really a hypothesis, and it's not original in that, you know, a good part of sexual abuse is not about sexual attraction necessarily. It's really about power. It's about exploiting someone who is vulnerable. And there is something in, you know, that intoxicating when someone takes up a role that people just admire for no reason other than they're in that role. It's almost this magical thinking, I think, that happens both with the person taking up the role as well as those who follow, that once the person is in this role, they can do no wrong. And so how that translates to whether it's sexual abuse of adults or children, there's this vulnerability factor. And I don't understand it. I mean, as a person who's experienced that, I know many survivors who are super guarded. I will never do, you know, to others what's happened to me, and are super careful. And I think there's something about, you know, that power that just blinds people to the impact that they have on others.
Do you think that a concept of purity, and I mean, I know in my case, which is specialized, they believed that pedophilia was a demon spirit, which could be cast out of a person. So here were pedophiles coming to our compound for healing. It seems to be really multi-layered from all these different directions, where I think there's some who do come for healing and then they're around children. I just myself have, am curious and still study why there's such a link between faith-based organizations and sexual abuse specifically, with such a high rate. And I have to tell you an interesting story about SNAP. When I was writing Cult Child, I wrote it alone and just dove into it and didn't really do a lot of research on how to soothe or anything like that. And I had a really horrible night terror. And I called my friend, I was just sobbing. And she's like, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to figure it out. I'll be over there in 20 minutes. So I'm like, great. So she shows up at my door with a comedy and 2 chocolate souffles. She had found the Snap network and found their one little paragraph on flashbacks. And she read that and said, okay, so I go get her something funny. I get something chocolate and soothing for her, and then I go spend time with her. So when you mentioned that organization, I thought it was nice that just somebody out of the blue was able to find one tiny little piece of how to soothe their friend, which is what makes what we do so crucial too, the support.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that we heal in community and connection with others, especially a healthy connection with others, because certainly with sexual abuse, I mean, the deep sense of self, the boundaries of who we are. Some people call that trauma, wounds where there's no blood. That takes time to reconnect in a healthy way. You asked before, though, this idea of why particularly to faith communities, and I don't know if there's any exact answer. I heard not too long ago a program by Malcolm Gladwell, sociologist, and I think his program is called Revisionist History, something like that. And there was this one episode, I think he called it Moral Entitlement. And there was this idea that when people, and his focus was on gender equity issues, that, and it could be on racial as well, it could be on any number of things. When people feel like they've done something good, they've allowed a woman to take a certain honor, they've allowed a person of color or a marginalized person to be accepted in some way, that somehow there's this reverse pushback where people then do something terrible. And I don't know how that holds up in a lot of areas, but somehow it makes sense with this unreasonable, inordinate amount of adulation that some people receive that is not earned, that somehow there's this self-destruct and other destruct reaction.
A mystification, I really like that word. I tell people, don't mystify me. Don't mystify other people, because we all walk our own paths and journeys, and we don't know what those details are. And being put on a pedestal is kind of a long way to fall, So what do you hope as far as your role with the Child Friendly Faith Project, some of your plans and goals? I mean, you bring so much to that organization. Do you care to share what you hope to do and move forward with?
Well, the starting point, of course, it says in our mission statement to raise awareness through education. And I think awareness is an important starting point, and it's necessary but not sufficient. And so by building relationships, ongoing relationships with different groups, or through whether it's a newsletter, website, podcasts, different resources, that then moves individuals and groups into kind of sensitivity or cognitive dissonance, where people now have to do something with this perspective about, am I in some way, is my organization in some way using our influence in a way that harms? And so education, by helping people understand more child development and to examine their own culture, their own organization. And then that hopefully leads to really some change within organizations, as well as partnership, maybe joining with groups that are working on legislation like the statute of limitations, or the religious exemptions. But all of this, I think, to me, starts with our organization actually being a healthy, introspective group with a variety of traditions and experiences where people are able to question, able to struggle with these deeper sense of, from my life experience, what is worth keeping and what is worth changing, in order for me to do good. And so I'm hoping that we model that. We've created a curriculum that is part of our designation program. And so one hope we had initially was to offer a curriculum that groups would take up, use for several weeks to reflect, and then take the next step to actually start to change policy or enforce different practices that would be promoting well-being. So all of this starts from the inside out, but certainly we have some brilliant resources and people already that we hope to share with others. And I think there's a critical mass in our society where people are going from silence to now speaking out and questioning. And I know that at some point that critical mass will shift towards action. But it is certainly a long and difficult challenge when we're talking about people's beliefs.
And if I could add one thing too to what we're trying to do, I don't feel like there's a very comprehensive, easy to find set of resources for survivors. There are untold numbers of memoirs written about people's individual stories. There are child abuse organizations that don't really want to get into the religious aspect. You have various chat groups that are geared to particular religions, and so the people that grew up in those religions, just they know that, and they want to get support from others that know their background. But I don't really know where survivors can go, where they can just find the information they need, whether it's for finding a book that's right for them or a great therapeutic program and that kind of thing. We do have a very large closed Facebook group called Child Friendly Faith, and I think that that's served a lot of people. But again, I just feel like there's a need for there to be a clearinghouse of information that is only for survivors of religious child maltreatment. And that's something we're about to launch in really soon.
It really is a very there is a difference, especially with the children. I was a child who grew up in this, and so I know it firsthand. And even when talking to, say, an adult who was lured, there's still a difference of the effect that it had on us as children specifically. An example would be, I don't think that people really think about how scary teaching a child about the rapture is. I was constantly in fear, and it even created a sense of doom for me in my adult life. And not until I connected that, like, why am I always feeling like this bottomless pit in my stomach? What is that about when life is okay right now? Well, what it was about was that I was literally programmed that any moment of any day could be my last. And I couldn't cognitively connect it, but when I finally did, it was quite profound. So it is those little things that we teach our children in this positive way, like, oh, God's going to come back and he's going to take us all. But that's not what we kids are thinking. We're like, oh my goodness, like, I'm going to get taken, and then I'm not going to see my friends. And our mind's in a whole different space.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, and it's amazing to me that when somebody knows something about child development, the way the brain develops, that we know that our neocortex isn't really fully developed till the 20s, right? And so children just have the earlier emotional brain that's helping them to survive and navigate, and so for that makes sense. It's unimaginable. It's incomprehensible the way an adult thinks to a child. And it's also then, to me, reprehensible when I think of the current discussion that's coming out of the Roy Moore case, how people talk about children as being able to give consent. It doesn't make sense.
No.
Kids are cognitively, intellectually, they're not able to do that. The brain's not developed. And for adults to have that speaks to ignorance of just child development, brain development, human development.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the tribalism that we were kind of talking about earlier, how children who are sexually abused oftentimes are not believed because there's this assumption that the alleged perpetrator is a priest or someone who's perceived to be faultless or close to God. With this Roy Moore allegation, where he was accused of molesting a 14-year-old girl, we have heard people come out in support of him and using Christianity as a way to justify his actions. Mm-hmm. They actually, they weren't saying, oh, we don't believe the girl. They were saying, well, even if it's true, it's okay. Because, Mary was very young when Joseph and she got married. It was just astounding to me. Back to, what Jaime was talking about regarding power. I mean, able to figure out a way to use a religious message to justify child molestation is just beyond me. But you can see how it can be used in all kinds of ways to harm people and certainly to harm children.
Yes, it's I saw that, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I saw a temporary attempt to create this new word called pedosexual, basically saying to try to fetish it, to put it into a fetish category. And, I am a victim of sexual trauma, and my sensical thought on it is that if a child likes something, they like it, right? So obviously it isn't good because children don't like it. It hurts. They say no. So the thought to even consider that a child would even consent to something that hurt them is to me like it's not far from critical thinking. It's them saying that is just an excuse. It's just another way of victim blaming a kid who's innocent. And then I had things said, when I was 11, 12, well, she walks seductively.
Mm.
Well, I also think that it shows self-serving
mm-hmm.
and narcissistic thinking. I mean, clearly the needs of that child in the Roy Moore case, I mean, the people that have defended his actions really, I think, could have cared less about the child's needs. I mean, that's the basic, I think, underlying thing here, where a child's needs gets shoved under so that, because people are finding so many other things to be more important. For example, mm-hmm. their status in a religious community.
Right.
Their meeting the approval of the religious leaders. It could be a wife needing to seek approval of her husband. And so she carries out some abusive things. That's what we call a middle manager parent. Mm-hmm. Most of the perpetrators are not these, mean, horrible people. They're people who, as middle manager parents, are just kind of carrying out the wishes of the power structure. And I just want to make sure we're clear, too, that oftentimes when I tell people that I research religious child maltreatment, the first thing they say is, oh, you mean in the Catholic Church? And that is certainly a huge part of it. But there are 4 very large categories of child maltreatment, and you mentioned one of them, Vennie, which is emotional abuse. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to understand that any kind of maltreatment or abuse and neglect that's perpetrated based on people's religious beliefs or is enabled by people's religious beliefs it is a form of RCM. So that is sexual abuse, covering up sexual abuse, which is a form of neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and there are others as well. So a big one is medical neglect, which we can get into. But I just kind of want to be clear that, any form of abuse and neglect that's enabled by religious beliefs that are held by perpetrators or the victims or the surrounding community belongs under this umbrella.
Do you find that you reach people? I find that people tend to listen more when I just simply talk to them about like the science. Like, did you realize when you land a blow to the bottom of your child's sacrum, this is what happens? Do you understand? Do you find a better response even from within the religious community when you say this is what is being done, and leaving the religion completely out of it and not even making that do you see where I'm going with that? Like when you have to bring it in a little bit, but when I talk about like physical punishment, I try not to so much talk about the doctrine. Sometimes I really hit on, spanking shattered my sacrum. I have now, as an adult, sometimes pain in my hips because of that. This is what will happen to your child. And I have found like some response from that, like really literally this light bulb look like, I never looked at it that way because I've always thought that's what I was supposed to do for God.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it makes sense. And anecdotally, I can see individuals who say, there's a physical harm, or there's a brain development issue. At this point, I don't see that at a cultural level, a shift in culture. It may shift some individuals' way of thinking and then perhaps acting, but to then be a larger conversation which would actually carry the weight of a practice or some kind of enforcement or anything like that is still in the works. I think we are moving in that direction.
I think so too, because it's so generational. I found that when I say, when I was taught like about speaking in tongues, I can remember as a kid watching people get filled with the Holy Spirit, but I never got filled with the Holy Spirit. So I always thought, gosh, like, why am I not special? Why can I not understand this language? And then I've heard people go, gosh, you know what? Me too. I thought the same thing, but nobody had ever connected with them like that to go, remember thinking this way, remember feeling this way. It's almost like at some point in your life, you forget about how you felt being raised that way for a moment.
Yeah, you mentioned that Me Too. I think that those are the kinds of powerful moments when people acknowledge their own experience and let other people hear that and connect with it. That frees up, going from silence to awareness to, doing something with that experience. And we have so much as kids that things that happen to us that we don't even understand until years later. That's such a common experience. I mean, from my case, it was a 30-year delay before I even remembered, and it was because it was in the news. And similarly, being in different settings and being able to acknowledge experience opens up then that awareness, self-awareness, and sometimes rage, right? The truth will make you free. The truth will get you mad, too. And who wants to feel that? But, so I can appreciate the finding out later and having others then resonate with our experience.
Yeah, and that rage and anger being really a projection of deep pain.
Absolutely.
Once I really came to understand that, actually, I became less angry. Once I was like, oh, okay, this is really pain. I can work on pain. So then I get to go underneath that anger and I'm not projecting it anymore.
And I think it's been a shame and a kind of betrayal for many survivors who come forward, then to have people critique them for just being an angry individual or just having some kind of individual problem, and not seeing it as an injury that needs care, needs to be believed so it can be healed. And I think that's, again, my experience, and I think many others, when they've come back to that faith group. Because as in family systems, when someone is confronting the abuser, the father figure, perhaps, it's not just that individual who's being confronted, it's the whole community. The whole group can push back and reject. And in some traditions, I mean, that's formally what people do. They kick people out or shun them, disfellow, or whatever it is.
Disfellowshipping in the Jehovah's Witnesses religion.
I was reading a part of your book. I relate to Jehovah's Witnesses and Pentecostals the most because there was that, both of that. We didn't celebrate anything, and then we also had the Holy Spirit and the demonology and all of that. But there's a quote from your book that says, Susan, the mother who earlier described having raised her children as Jehovah's Witnesses, has great regrets for instilling in her children fears that she had come to believe herself. And this is her quote: I think there was a certain amount of psychological terror with the kind of things that we were taught to teach our children about the future, what God was going to do, the destruction he was going to bring on mankind, fear of spirit creatures, fear of the devil, fear of demons, because we were taught that those were real beings and that had a real influence on day-to-day life. And that terror is transmitted to your children. I really, really regret that. That hit me so deep because I was so terrified of demons. I mean, they literally used demonology on us as a big fear tactic. And that's the best way I've heard it described, that it is terror.
Just that before your program came on, there was some person speaking about fear. And it's something in our imagination that what struck me when I was listening to that was that fear is, I think, the motivation often for people to take up, kind of embrace religion's magical thinking, not the beauty of what religion can bring. Because I think religion, in Latin anyway, religio means to bind together. And that's a beautiful thing, to be connected, right? To have a sense of identity or ways to appreciate. But the abuse, the twisting of religion, I think, is in giving some magical power to an individual to take care of that fear, and then allowing that person with the magical power then to have way more influence and authority and liberty than they should have.
Yeah, I really saw that when my cult leader died in 1979. He had always preached that if he died, that was the end of the world. So the news came that he died in this plane wreck. And so we really literally were preparing for the end of the world, which I don't really know, looking back, what that actually looked like. It was very confusing, right? They're packing, we're going to go to the woods, but why are we going to the woods if we're getting raptured? So this is, again, how a child thinks. And then a couple of months went by and the world didn't end. And then came the confusion because that dissonance is being cracked just a little bit, but then swooped in the next elder. And as soon as that swooped in to take that control, boom, the minds were closed again. So it's this generational passing on of this locking up of the mind. And I love that you guys do directly connect with parents. To me, that's like ground level work.
Absolutely, because what parent really doesn't want the best for their child? Often we only know the parenting that we've gotten, or the parent we're trying to get away from, that maybe negative modeling. And so we need to, in this busy time, busy society with 724 information and no time to actually stop and step back and reflect, we need to reflect on what we got and what was harmful, and adapt. adapt for the current issues that weren't so present. I mean, the whole technical, social media and all the things that are available in technology are a new way for kids to be vulnerable again. And so, this is such an important thing to work with parents.
I agree. I would love to provide support to parents who are in oppressive religious communities. I think that there are those diehard folks that, they're never going to listen to a word we say. But I believe that even in the most authoritarian type of religious cultures, there are parents who are wanting to peel away, that feel uncomfortable about the rules that are being put down and demanded of everyone, who are uncomfortable because some of the congregants or people in their community are sort of, pushing their families to do things that are unhealthy. And, we see a lot with religious leaders that have no training in child development or child psychology, but they're literally instructing their congregants on how to raise their kids. Mm-hmm. A lot of parents are uncomfortable with that. And so, I'd love to be able to provide resources where they can safely peruse those and see and just get a better handle on what actually is happening in that power dynamic. And because I think it's so hard for a lot of people in those closed cultures to make a break.
Because parents are looking, parents that have a faith are looking for their reverend or their guide to help them with these issues. And so that's where that responsibility is upon, the pastor or whomever to really have an ethical system about how they're guiding parents in regards to their children.
Well, there are those that feel that religious leaders have no place in telling parents how to raise their kids. I mean, if they've done sufficient vetting of materials and educational booklets and things like that, and they want to offer those to provide some support to parents, or they bring in qualified lecturers to talk to parents, I mean, great. But unless someone has training, and I think some pastoral clergy do have some of that, but a majority of them don't. And so, really, you've got a nice community that can offer a lot to families, and you have adults that can enjoy some of the spiritual benefits, and if it's done well, the children can also. But is that really the job of religious leaders, to be telling families, what they're doing right or what they're doing wrong? I tend to believe they're not qualified to do that.
What is the answer when there is a book, the Bible or whatever book is being used? What is the answer? How do we reach, and I know we've got about 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes before the break starts, but how do we reach that separation, and how does it happen? It seems extremely multi-layered to me.
Well, one of the hopes that we had with the designation program was that people would pay attention to their own experience as a starting point. Mm-hmm. I have a little expression that too often we see what we believe rather than believe what we see. And so it takes sometimes just practice to actually examine what is our experience and what do we know, not what is a belief. And so with that process, then people can begin that questioning. Because the Bible is one source. Community in the origins of the written scriptures preceded the written. They came in lived experience, and then they came in shared experience, and then they came in written form. And so that's a real important starting point. And all these revelations, whether they're political folks or religious folks or movie mogul folks that are exposing the reality of predatory behavior, the reality of people giving assent to predators, and not conscious assent, but just being overwhelmed in the moment of trauma when people are facing something they don't understand. People go through that typical fight, flight, freeze, or faint reaction. And that my experience was I left my body. I mean, years afterwards, I realized that's what happened. So our experience is leading, and the collective experience, I believe, is going to be painful and also really, really important and helpful for people to then to start to question.
Yeah, because it's that fine line between, I mean, definitely, you know, I'm a big supporter of everyone being able to have a choice as an adult of what feels good to your spirit, whatever that looks like, you know, and it harm none. And so I do see as I look more and more that on one side, for some people, it may seem like an easy issue, but it's really not. It's a very complex and multi-layered issue. It may be as simple as self-healing and self-awakening, but therein, I think, lies that difficult line from going from ego or, you know, what someone really feels is right and being able to see. You know, one thing I thought about is my ex-cult leader. He had an actual manual, and I have a copy of it on how to train a child, and it made me think of that book, To Train Up a Child. And I'm wondering, like, you know, we live in this society where, you know, child pornography is illegal, or all these things are illegal. Why is a book like How to Train Up a Child, which literally teaches a parent how to hit their child, why is that legal in our country?
Well, it's been part of the American culture for a very long time, and I kind of think it's probably been the case in the rest of the world too. But I don't know if it's because white people in this country were, you know, established under Christian Puritan type laws, or because we're a little bit more geographically isolated, you know. But the fact is that most other countries really frown on physical punishment. A number of European countries have banned it in schools, and even some have banned it in the home. In this country, people, especially religious conservatives, and that's across the board, whether it's Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, physical punishment is a big part of their community and home culture. People in Christian circles who don't want to give up hitting children as a way to improve their behavior will oftentimes point to Proverbs in the Old Testament, which oftentimes talks about something called the rod. The expression, spare the rod, spoil the child, does not appear in the Bible, but many Christians actually believe that it does. And so they feel justified, and especially when they hear, say, their pastor talking about the need to spank and how it'll save their child from going to hell, or it'll just, you know, it will just make for a more compliant child. Really what they're wanting to do is control children. And there are theological reasons for that and psychological reasons for that. But the fact is that when it comes to spanking, we as a culture, not, you know, this is not the case to our neighbors in the north in Canada or Mexico, but we are, you know, the numbers have been going down, you know, year to year. But at this, but we do use physical punishment much more than other countries. And so, you know, while it's not always religiously motivated, it is still something that's promoted throughout many different communities, even though there is so much study that's been done on this showing that it can lead to serious psychological and sexual problems in adults who were spanked as children. And I have not found one study that shows that using physical punishment enhances the well-being of children.
I completely agree. It makes me think of a couple of things. one, that this country is twofold, where religious extremists in our history, were running from Europe to hold on to their own faith, which unfortunately was quite extremist. At the same time, there was a slavery culture going on where whipping was being passed down and religion was also being passed down. So it's like we're on what, the sixth or seventh generation of this culture in our country.
Right. And just to give you an idea of how religious belief and customs play a role, if you look at a map that shows which states allow for corporal punishment in schools, you will see that a vast majority of those states are all in the Southern Bible Belt. And that's not a coincidence.
I'm looking at that. I took some time to look at, it says, while 31 states have now banned corporal punishment, these states still allow it. Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Wyoming. That was as of 2014.
Right.
And the shame too, and this is the psychological part of it. I remember even post-Colt being thrown into public school, they called it getting licks. You went to get licks. You're going to take detention, you're going to take licks. Well, you're going to take licks because you don't want your parents to know you have detention. But the shame as you get older, like in high school to in middle age school, and they're making you grab the edge of the desk, and there's a witness being brought in because that rule was made. And so there's that psychological shame along with the physical pain.
Well, there's also shame with younger children too, as you know. And we talked earlier about kind of what to do with that anger. I think it's so sad that children and teenagers are denied the right to be angry. That is such a destructive type of psychology to put on a kid, where the whole community is sort of on board with this way of, quote, disciplining. Mm-hmm. And they are allowed to feel shame, they're allowed to feel guilt, they're allowed to feel terrible about themselves and self-hatred and self-loathing, but they are not deserved to feel anger. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's such a robbery of a child's soul in a way.
Yeah, because really, if a child is angry, possibly the right question to ask them is, what are you hurting about? And letting them express their pain.
Yeah, I mean, it's a denial of individuality, really, and intellectual autonomy. I mean, it goes beyond even just that one emotion. I devoted my book to children who were denied the right to question, because I feel like so many children in communities where they're basically considered to be property are not permitted the right to really explore in a natural way that all children need to do. And when you look at certain religious communities, I'm not talking about liberal ones or more towards the moderate. We see these problems in more conservative, ultra-conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical, orthodox type of faith communities. And it's really just, I would want to say there's sort of this fear of things getting out of control. You notice that a lot of the messaging in those cultures has to do with fear, like outsiders are out to persecute us. They raise children. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, you mentioned earlier, to look down upon or fear people outside the family. So even if kids are going to public school, they're made to feel bad if they develop a friendship with someone who's not a Jehovah's Witness.
I was reading a page in your book, and like on this one page, you like lay out three different dynamics of how I grew up. The first one, you talk about a religious leader is said to have frightened a group of teenagers by having them witness his abuse of a child, which was something we often, I mean, abuse was all around us. And how Warren Jeffs, picks up the little boy and shakes him in front of the class, and the public humiliation. And then down at the bottom, and I did this as a kid, 35-year-old Mark Casey, Mary Casey's son, remembers his family joining a new, particularly charismatic Assembly of God church in Texas when he was 10. As Casey told me on June 5th of 2008, no one had told him what to expect, and his mother was not there to protect him because she was up front playing the piano. Suddenly, Casey recalls, a group of adults surrounded him and began strongly urging him to speak in tongues. Terrified, Casey faked speaking in tongues just to make the group go away. They would just keep on praying for you and very aggressively praying with their hands on you, he says. I felt very scared and pressured. They did that to us. They would stand in circles. So you had one circle with their hands on you, and then the circle around them with their hands on them. And when I read that, that's exactly the things that I did. You're not only faking it to try to fit in, you're also kind of hoping that if you kind of fake it till you make it, if I fake it, maybe eventually, like, I'll really feel it.
Yeah, right. And we've seen that same kind of sad situation with kids who are sick, mm-hmm. and everybody's praying over the kid,
yep.
and he or she is not getting well.
Mm-hmm.
And who feels badly about that? The parents, and certainly the kid, because they're maybe not trying hard enough. They're not mm-hmm. faithful enough. If it doesn't fit in to the religious script, so to speak, then it's always the fault of those who are not fitting in, who are not abiding by the rules, or So it's really a lot of harm that's done to families as a whole, and that's why I really want us to be able to reach out to those kind of folks.
Yeah, I was talking about that because I think that when you talk about faith healing, because I grew up faith healed as well, we weren't taken to the doctor. There's all these little nuances that, because when faith healing is talked about, it's sometimes generalized, unless, of course, it's us talking about it. But I had one conversation where I said, well, have you ever had the flu? Okay, yes, you've had the flu. Remember how every joint in your body ached? Yes. Remember how you had a headache? Yes. Now, imagine 10 to 15 people standing around your bed, loudly speaking in tongues and praying over you while your body is in that much trauma. It's almost like you have to bring out those tiny details. Then they're like, I would go crazy. Well, imagine being a child and this is what is happening. Maybe it is those little tiny details that wake people up to go, okay, that if that happened to me, I would be angry.
Yeah, or even just having a headache. I mean,
yes,
I had headaches a lot as a kid. And, just the idea of not being given a pain reliever when you're in excruciating pain, just because you're being exploited for the religious agenda of the adults around you.
Mm-hmm. And adults who've had multiple losses within their family. I try to be open-minded and see everything from both sides, where they're justifying this is God's will. Okay, well, God took child 1. Okay, child 2 comes and God takes child 2. And there's that thing. I think they almost have to make themselves believe it, because the opposite of that would be facing that they let their child pass away in a very suffering way.
Yeah. I think that is a big motivator to avoid regret.
Yeah.
It's really until someone is out of that dangerous community that, and they have to seek counseling. I mean, there's really no way to heal without therapy. That's that, there are only very, very few people who can figure that out on their own.
I often wondered if my mother had ever taken that step to actually turn around and face really what she was lured into. She was definitely lured over time, over a span of like 4 years. It took that long. I wonder if she would have been able to actually survive mentally. When I, as a child, can't like wrap my head around my own experiences sometimes, how does a mother or a parent wrap their head around, accepting these levels of abuses to the point of death?
I know it's a hard road. It's a lot of work, just as much as it's a lot of work for you and for other survivors, because there's so much wrapped up in trying to understand that the person that harmed you, you really want to believe they loved you.
Yeah.
A lot of people have a very difficult time being able to look at the individual that clothed them and took care of their needs, and also caused them psychological and or physical distress. That's a really difficult thing. But I do think that therapists who have experience and training, particularly in ideologically driven type of abuse, are able to do great things for survivors.
I've even found, I'm in therapy. I go every week. I mean, I definitely need that therapeutic support. And there are good therapists out there that are interested. My therapist has read my book. She reads my blog. She, was interested in getting to know me and understanding my experiences. When you go and you have a chance to, say, speak to a congregation, what is your main hope to speak to them, and how do you know what's right to say? How do you make that discernment when you're going to speak to a largely religious-based group?
Well, usually churches or synagogues or mosques that actually want to hear about religious child maltreatment don't really have the problems. They're interested more in partnering with us and having us sort of train some of their people. We have this curriculum. Jaime mentioned the designation program, and that's a curriculum that religious organizations can use behind closed doors. It's a discussion series. We're looking for religious organizations that want to partner with us to make that curriculum available to others. I think, too, a big motivator for why religious organizations do want to learn about it is because they love their faith and they find it very distressing that religion is being used in this harmful way. So I think that they come at it from a kind of a different angle than a lot of other people would, but it's still a great open door. So I would say that those people that I speak to are on such kind of liberal end that they tend not to have problems, but they may have members who have relationships with other people that are in, say, a more fundamentalist version of what they're in, or just friends that they know who are experiencing those kind of problems. I'll never forget speaking to this one church in Austin, and there was a woman who asked a question. She was kind of elderly and burst into tears as she was talking about her daughter, who was raising her very young son in an emotionally abusive way, having him kind of beg, if you wanted a grape, he had to sort of pray to Jesus every time or something like that for him to just get something to eat. And the grandmother felt helpless. So, I wouldn't say that I change anything that I say, really. And our curriculum is something I think that's powerful because it's in their control. I mean, we offer a liaison that works with them, but it's really all done behind their closed doors so that there's that feeling of safety and not judgment.
Do you think that people who utilize religions to abuse children would be more likely to still be abusive if they weren't a religious person, that it's something that they already are, that they're already a sadistic person, possibly?
That's definitely the case with some individuals. There are people who don't need a religious excuse to harm children. They're usually on some kind of power kick, or they have anger management problems. They could be mentally ill, etc. But I think that the vast majority of people that commit these crimes are actually, again, going back to that idea of people being middle managers, I see them as being victims too.
Right.
So in those situations, I absolutely believe that a lot of those people, if they were just in a healthier religious environment, or if religion was taken out of the equation altogether, would absolutely not harm a child. A big definition of middle manager, the way that I see them, middle manager parents I'm talking about, is that they, for whatever reason, whatever influences are going on, they do not look into their own instincts in making decisions about their children. That is kind of blocked. They do some of that blocking, and then others block it too. I do think that most parents, if they're in a healthy environment, will have good instincts and make good decisions for their kids. I think that's just natural where we are, evolutionarily speaking.
I think my mom's a really good example of that, and that actually kind of helped me come to terms with some of the anger that I was holding on toward her, that remembering back of who she was before the cult got a hold of her, that she loved to go to parties and she didn't ever hit any of us, and coming to terms with that she too was a victim, it helped me heal just a little bit. It doesn't erase accountability, I don't think. It just helps create that explanation for the child that, okay, we were both victims in differing ways.
Yeah, and I think it's also hard sometimes for parents to even know they're in a harmful environment. They may be getting something out of it for themselves psychologically, or maybe based on how they grew up, are vulnerable individuals. In my book, I have a very long list of questions for parents to ask themselves to help them determine whether or not they are raising their children in what I call a religious authoritarian culture. And the kind of questions that they can ask themselves are things like, does my place of worship, do the members believe that they have the only answer to theological questions and everyone else is wrong or misguided? Does my religious leader tell me how to parent my child? Or does he or she require or strongly urge me to use physical punishment? If I see or suspect abuse or neglect in my religious community, do I have any qualms about reporting it? Or will it be frowned upon if I don't either be quiet about it or bring it to the religious leader? Questions like that.
So it sounds a little bit like you're able to reach people more, not necessarily going in for those who are already deeply embedded, but trying to really more reach and do the damage control before that person is lured into that deeply embedded space.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn about this. And my feeling is if we can just raise the level of education of the general public and the media and people who work in child protection and survivors, and then a lot of those people are part of faith communities. I feel like you're right. We can't go into, say, Kingdom Hall where Jehovah's Witnesses are practicing and saying, you're really doing a bad job here in raising your kids. That's not going to go anywhere. But we can offer well-researched information and academic studies. We can blog, we can do programs like we're doing right now to get the general public to understand how these things all link together. A lot of people probably understand what's gone on in the Catholic Church. A lot of people probably understand, or have heard about those faith healing deaths among children and so forth. People throw around the term, I'm a recovering Catholic, I'm a recovering this or that, and it's joked about. What they're really talking about there is religious child abuse and emotional abuse. What I tried to do in my book is to show how all of these types of maltreatment tie together, and what are the main risk factors. How do you know when children are particularly vulnerable? What kind of religion is actually harmful? And I concluded that it doesn't matter if whether it's called Christian or Jewish or Muslim or something altogether different. It really has to do with the governance of the culture that the community that the child is being raised in. So if you have a very strict hierarchy, for example, if there's a lot of fear-based teachings in the community, and thirdly, if it's socially separatist, that's where you're going to see these kinds of problems. And that's often going to be the case in what I call ultra-conservative religious cultures.
So how do we reach those people? I mean, do we give up hope on them? I mean, those are the children I think about that are stuck and trapped in those situations. What is there a solution, or is that what we are doing now, which is figuring out what that solution is to reach that level where those really horrific, even deeper abuses are happening?
Well, it would help if the laws would not give special privileges to certain religions and religious organizations. So, for example, in Idaho, it's not a crime to deny your child medical care if it's for religious reasons. But that aside, I think we just approach cases of abuse and neglect just like we would any other. If you have reason to suspect, you don't have to have absolute knowledge, but if you do suspect that there's abuse or neglect going on, you report it. You have to report it. If you suspect that maybe you're not aware of any particular kinds of abuses, but you just have an uneasy feeling because, say, a religious group that someone who's raising a child, and you just have an uneasy feeling about some of the rules you're hearing about and the customs and things like that, not because they're unusual, but because they feel unhealthy, then I think you need to really take the time to engage with the people who are in those organizations. You need to hear them out. You need to get close to them. You need to just kind of get as familiar as you can with what's going on. Gain some trust, and then if you then hear about problems that raise to the level of abuse or neglect, then you just have to report it.
And then there is that issue of somehow getting people to take the time to show up for the legislation to try to get it repealed, as in you mentioned, as in Idaho. I'm looking at the map, Washington State is another one. I mean, the state I live in allows for religious exemption from negligent homicide, manslaughter, or capital murder. I mean, it is as simple as repealing a law so that those prosecutors can prosecute. But when we have church members who are part of that legislative system, there's that problem.
Yeah, it really is a problem in Idaho. I don't think we're hearing about these problems so much in Washington and other places because there is not a large, powerful religious organization like there is in Idaho, and there was in Oregon. And what happens oftentimes is, these religious exemptions sit on the books, but then you'll have a death, and then another one, and then another one, and then people feel like they finally have to act. But in Idaho, that's taken unusually long for a lot of reasons. But I do think that once the media attention just gets to be too much, they finally will do it. It's difficult there because people are just I don't know. I know that the legislators, a bunch of them, do believe that they're doing something righteous by allowing parents to neglect their children's medical care. I mean, they have said, a number of them have said, essentially they're doing even the children a favor by allowing them to die that way. Unfortunately, the rest of the legislature doesn't have the courage to get up and say this is wrong and really, really organize. It's just such a powerful, it's big religion there. I mean, it's just such a powerful lobby, if you will. It's hard for them to get around that. But I do think the members of the public are rising up a little bit more than they have before.
Because really it is a federal, I mean, it's a violation of the Constitution. And so is this something that if the federal government wanted to slam the hammer down on, they could slam the hammer down on it and say you are violating these children's constitutional rights?
Well, I'm not a legal expert, so I can't speak in great detail, but I can tell you that the federal child abuse legislation called CAPTA has an exemption in there for various things like spanking and faith healing, medical neglect, and things like that. And secondly, in order for there even to be a lawsuit, even within a particular state, you need to have a plaintiff. You need to have someone who has been hurt by that. Well, these are children, and a lot of them die before they get to be adults. So that's a big stumbling block.
Wow. So repealing that law is really basically the only answer. What can citizens do, and those listening who I'm getting this feedback even in the chat room that, I mean, everybody's always appalled when it comes to the safety of children, and we're listening to these things, and a lot of us are survivors. Yeah. From this perspective, what can citizens do to get involved with getting these laws repealed?
I forgot to, I did want to mention that there is a local nonprofit organization called Protect Idaho Kids, protectidahokids.org. And that is specifically focused on trying to get the legislature to repeal those exemptions. So people that want to get involved in what's going on in Idaho, please get in touch with Protect Idaho Kids.
I wanted to tell you that I had an email conversation with the ACLU in Idaho, just asking them, why have they not made this a priority? I mean, not that all social issues aren't important, because they are. But for me, there isn't really, like, children are, the most important. And their answer to me was that, they have to spread their funds out, and they just didn't make it an important priority. So it's nice to know that there's another organization stepping in. And they did say that they were looking at getting a little bit more involved next year. So hopefully together those two can do something about that.
Yeah, and there is that tricky legal nature of needing to find someone to serve as a plaintiff, and that's been a big stumbling block, I know, in Idaho.
Right. So when you, Mike, let me want to make sure I ask this question right. A plaintiff isn't needed to repeal the law. Am I understanding that?
No, excuse me, that is what would be needed to sue.
Okay.
To sue the, they could sue a number of entities, but they could basically sue the state.
And then would it free up the prosecutors as well to be able to bring more charges? Like it would take out their capability to use that as a defense.
A successful lawsuit would get to a higher court that would deem that the religious exemption law violates the rights of children, and they would then have to make some kind of remedy. And so at that point, depending on what the decision was, then the legislature would respond to that, and that could be by repealing. But then, of course, there's always hope that legislators will just do the right thing and say, we don't want to see more children die in our state needlessly. We're talking about kids that are dying from the most treatable things, such as an infection. You mentioned the flu, pneumonia. There was one girl who, at the age of 15, got food poisoning, and because no one took her to the doctor, and she just was vomiting continuously after a few days, she died of a ruptured esophagus. These kids die of the most horrific things you can imagine. You take a child who has diabetes. I mean, it is extremely excruciating to die from diabetes. No adult understands that, because no one has had to, very rarely would go into a diabetic coma to the point where they would be that close to death because we have insulin. But a child who's denied insulin will go into that diabetic coma and ultimately pass away. So it's beyond the pale that these legislators allow this to go on, but they believe so strongly in this idea of faith healing, and religion's behind it, so it's got to be good, and that's the kind of thing we're dealing with.
What would you say to someone who said this statement? Don't get me wrong, whipping a kid on the butt is okay. I say it just can't go overboard.
Well, I think I would first want to understand their reasons for doing it. I think that very often what that conversation then leads to is finding out that they were beat or spanked as a child. It was part of their culture growing up. And they feel that they are in some way like dishonoring their parents by doing something their parents would object to. I think a lot of this stuff is just this, part of a personal connection or an association they have with their own upbringing. So I think it's important to kind of understand where that person is coming from. What kind of a dilemma are they trying to solve? It may turn out that it's not so much about that, but that they have a child who is a special needs child and needs special attention due to ADHD or something like that. In which case, you can offer resources so that they can at least look into that more. But I do think that if people come at it with, well, I know I'm right about this, it takes some work to get them to really see that there are alternatives to that would meet their objectives.
Yeah, because it makes me think of that understanding that it's actually quite easy to use fear to bring a child into compliance. So you tell a child, I'm going to hit you, that child is going to comply because they don't want to get hit. But it takes a lot of patience to love a child so much and that they love themselves, that they have their own ethical system. So now I'm looking at the chat room, and again, here comes that phrase, spare the rod and spoil the child, that people really believe is in the Bible, and it is not in the Bible. Do you touch on sometimes the things in the Bible that are against children, like child sacrifice, Lot's daughters with the incest, and things like that?
Absolutely. I have a whole chapter devoted to the Bible. I didn't really get into other religious texts, so I just kind of focused on that. And I point out that there are some passages that are obviously they were written by people who were benevolent, wanting to be benevolent to children. They were wanting to take care of children, and so I think it is important to take a look at those benevolent passages. But unfortunately, the vast majority of passages in the Bible that have to do with children, and that includes the Ten Commandments as well, don't have to do at all with fulfilling children's needs. It has often much more to do with fulfilling the needs of the overall community, to keeping people in line and that kind of a thing. Also, when you look at stories like you mentioned, the rape of Lot's daughters, or him offering his daughters to be raped and things like that, there are actually many stories in the Bible that have to do with rape and incest, and I think that has some weight too, because they do tell these stories to children, which is not good if it involves violence and things like that. But I also think that when a whole religious community is hearing their religious leader telling these stories involving children, and it has to do with violence and all kinds of horrific things, I think that really interferes with how people perceive children. And that's a real problem.
Yes, because they're perceived as property and not as their own individual.
Yeah, I mean, I as I said, I don't believe that everything in the Bible is bad when it comes to children. But the harm that comes is where you have people that refuse to believe that any part of it is bad. And, you'll have some religious folks that'll say, oh, well, that's cherry picking. You can't cherry pick. Oh, yeah, you have to cherry pick. Cherry pick the hell out of the Bible. I mean, you have to use your own ability to reason and your own ability to feel compassion to decide what you feel is a healthy directive for yourself, for your children, and others. And you decide, no, this part here really doesn't go with the ethics that are, I want for my family. That's just going to be put off to the side. We're just going to focus on the ones that we feel are helpful. And by all means, look to other sources too, besides the Bible, to learn about things like child development and that kind of thing. Obviously, people back in biblical times knew nothing about child development, and they had other things to worry about too, like their community surviving and that kind of thing. So it's a lot about just knowledge and relying on your own ideas about healthy and ethical behavior. I think when it comes to sorting out which religious passages are right for you.
Yeah, M. Dolan Hickman was on a couple of weeks ago, and he had an abusive father, and he was telling me about how the abuse changed when his father was lured into this cult. So before, the abuse was more to keep the children out of his way. So he would throw something at them the kids would run outside, and then they didn't have to be bothered with their father anymore. But after the religion came in, everything changed. He said the discipline became part, the abuse became part of the religion. It was something now that his father felt he had to do.
Yeah, and that is terrifying, because the difference between those two things is that I think in the first case, I compare it to like when somebody abuses a child because they're drunk, and then the next day the perpetrator says to the child, I'm so sorry. I never should have done that. That was horrible of me. As bad as the abuse was, that acknowledgement that child was victimized is a really important part of healing. And I feel so much for kids that are in environments where we've seen horrible cases of physical punishment where everything's done not out of anger. No one's lashing out. It's done in this really methodical way that can take place over hours. And then, the family is like taking a break to pray or read the Bible, and they go back to whipping the kid. I mean, it sounds so sick to so many people. But when you have this, very measured way of going about it, it's really, to me, even more insidious.
Yeah, that was a tool that was used on us. You would get spanked and then you would be left to wait, or you would be sent to wait and then you lose track of time. And it's just sitting there in literal terror and fear, waiting for it to be your turn. So we have about, I'm going to say maybe 5 to 6 minutes left, before we are over. Unfortunately, it always goes by so fast, and there's so much I love to hit on with you. I just really love what you're doing and appreciate your work, and really encourage parents to pick up your book, Breaking Their Will, and just read it. Just read it and think as you're reading it. I mean, it opened my eyes even to my own experiences as a child who was abused in that way. I learned from your book too. So is there anything that you want to get in there before, the music starts to play or anything?
I would just encourage people who are looking for a community of support to go to our Facebook group called Child Friendly Faith. And as I said before, it's closed. So if you do still have connections to family members who are still in your religious community, or even you yourself are still kind of trapped in it, people from the outside would be able to see that you are in the group, but they won't see what you're posting. So there's some level of safety there. Also, our website is childfriendlyfaith.org, and we're always looking for people who want to help us spread the word. We're always looking for great resources, for volunteers, people who want to tell their stories, maybe write a guest blog post. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we could be helped with those who care about the issue and want to participate.
Yeah, it's important, I think, for us to share each other's work. If you're on social networking, connect and share. Sharing is what gets the word out. Connect with, I love to connect with you. You're in my preferred feed, right? So when Thanks for joining me, Vennie Kocsis, and remember, get through it, don't stay in it.